He sat alone at the defense table, no lawyer beside him, no tie to straighten, just an old, ill-fitting green jacket that whispered of decades past, and a manila folder gripped like a lifeline. Harold Evans didn't look like a man preparing for battle. But battles don't always announce themselves with noise and flags. Sometimes, they begin in silence, in a room filled with impatient sighs and glances heavy with judgment. He hadn't spoken a word since the court session began, not because he lacked the will, but because he understood the weight of waiting. His journey to this moment hadn't started in the courtroom. It began long before, in another world, under another kind of fire, when uniform and duty defined his every breath. But life had changed since those days in Fallujah. Now, he lived alone in a rent-controlled apartment he had occupied for 17 years. The walls were stained, the radiator clanked like an old memory trying to be heard, and the third-floor stair creaked in protest every time he climbed it. Once he reported these things. Once he believed someone would care. But landlords changed, policies shifted, and eventually he stopped asking. The world moved on without him. When the rent spiked by $500 overnight, Harold didn't protest. He couldn't. On a fixed income, and with no one left to lean on, no lawyer, no children, no neighbors close enough to call friend, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He stood up. Quietly. Deliberately. The way he once had before dawn patrols and fire missions. He retrieved a worn folder from above the fridge, the rubber band brittle with time, and laid its contents on the table like a soldier laying out gear before a final march. A DD-214, 2 commendation letters, a faded photo of his unit, and one medal wrapped in cloth, the Silver Star. He hadn't touched it in years. Not out of shame, but because some honors aren't worn, they're carried. He didn't rehearse a speech. He didn't consult a law book. Instead, he polished his boots with the care he used to show before inspections, pressed his shirt with the back of a spoon heated over the gas stove, and at precisely 9:20 a.m. on the morning of his eviction hearing, he stood in line at the courthouse, shoulders back, folder tucked under one arm, walking not with the hope of victory, but with the resolve to be seen. The courtroom wasn't ready for him. Not the judge with her tired eyes, nor the attorney across the aisle with his dismissive smirk and sleek leather folder. To them, Harold was just another old man buying time with outdated paperwork and misplaced pride. They didn't see the years behind the silence. They didn't see the quiet edge of sacrifice beneath his worn collar. But Harold didn't come for recognition. He came to remind them, not just of who he was, but of who they had forgotten. This was the beginning of his call to adventure, not a battle for land or medals, but for dignity. For the right to still matter in a world that measured worth in signatures and billable hours. And like every hero's journey, it began not with grandeur, but with a quiet decision to stand when the world expected him to sit. The bailiff called the room to order, and the clatter of shuffling papers and murmuring voices gave way to silence as the judge entered. Harold rose slowly, joints stiff from the cold and age, but with a posture sharpened by habit, by memory. The judge nodded, barely, and Harold sat again, alone at his table. Across from him, the opposing counsel, a young man in a sharp gray suit, didn't look up. He was busy tapping on his tablet, thumbs scrolling with casual detachment, the way one might review a shopping list, not a man's future. Case 19, CV, 1187. Evans versus Clearway Properties. The clerk's voice rang out like a verdict itself. The attorney for Clearway, Mr. Barnes, according to the file, stood, adjusting his tie with the polished ease of someone too comfortable in courtrooms. He smiled, not out of politeness, but strategy. Everything about him was curated, the designer glasses, the measured pauses, even the inflection in his voice. He began with confidence, barely glancing toward Harold. "Your Honor," Barnes said, "this is, respectfully, a straightforward matter. My client seeks restitution for non-payment of rent over the past 3 months, per the terms of the lease. The defendant, while sympathetic in circumstance, has offered no legal defense. We are requesting summary judgment and immediate possession of the unit." There it was, sympathetic in circumstance. a phrase dressed in compassion but emptied of meaning. Barnes said it as if Harold were a faded mural, worthy of a passing glance, but irrelevant to the present structure. The courtroom nodded with silent agreement. Even the judge looked as though she'd heard it all before, and perhaps she had. Another old man with a folder of memories. Another relic in a city that no longer had room for its past. Barnes gestured to the lease agreement, projected neatly on the screen beside him. The lease clearly stipulates an annual increase, and the defendant was notified via certified mail. We have records of delivery and a copy of the signed receipt. Harold watched, listening, not moving. His hands were folded atop the folder, fingers curled over its frayed edges like armor. Barnes continued, with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Respectfully, Your Honor, we cannot allow emotion to override contractual obligations. This isn't a matter of sentiment. It's a matter of law. That was when Harold felt it, not anger, but the cold pressure of being erased. He wasn't a person in their eyes. He was a delay. A procedural inconvenience. The years he had given, the nights he had spent awake listening to the radiator hiss like distant mortars, the weight of silence in an apartment that had been more bunker than home. None of it mattered here. Not to Barnes. Not to the system. Not to anyone, it seemed. The judge turned to Harold. Mr. Evans, do you have anything to present in your defense? It was a simple question, but Harold heard it differently. Do you have anything left? He rose slowly, folder in hand, and approached the podium. The room didn't expect much. Barnes had already turned back to his tablet, typing notes for the next case. But Harold didn't speak right away. He stood, steady and quiet, looking at the judge, not pleading, but present. This wasn't the part of the journey where the hero fought back with swords or grand speeches. This was the part where he refused to disappear. Harold stood at the podium, the folder resting in his hands like something sacred. The courtroom waited, politely, perhaps even impatiently, expecting a tremble in his voice, an unfocused ramble, the familiar cadence of the old and forgotten. But Harold didn't speak right away. He looked down at the folder, then slowly opened it. There was no dramatic flourish. No exhibits marked with red stickers. Just a series of aged photographs, letters yellowed with time, and a worn envelope with the Department of Veterans Affairs stamp barely visible. From beneath it, he pulled a folded sheet, creased so many times it seemed more fragile than paper should be. He placed it carefully on the stand. I'd like to enter this into the record, Harold said, his voice low but even. It's a letter from 1982. From the original landlord, Mr. Saul Rosenthal. The judge raised an eyebrow. Barnes looked up now, curious. Harold continued. He was the man who rented the apartment to me when I returned from Beirut. He was a first-generation American, lost his parents in the camps. He said soldiers should always have a place to return to. He gave me a lease, yes, but also his word. This letter is in his handwriting. It states that as long as I lived, and as long as the building stood, I'd never be removed. He turned it around so the judge could see. The ink had faded, but the meaning was intact. To Sergeant Harold Evans. This apartment at 614C East 10th Street will remain your home. No matter how the neighborhood changes. No matter who owns the building. This is yours. As long as I breathe, and even after. Thank you for your service. Saul Rosenthal. The silence in the room shifted. Not louder, heavier. The kind of stillness that comes not from boredom, but from the weight of something unspoken being suddenly made real. Harold reached again into the folder and pulled out a photograph, a young soldier in a hospital bed, bandaged, staring straight at the camera, jaw clenched in defiance or pain. It was hard to tell. The same soldier who now stood in a courtroom, 40 years later, defending not just a shelter, but a promise made in a different America. He spoke quieter now. I don't expect sentiment to overrule the law, as Mr. Barnes said. But sometimes, promises made in good faith, written not in contracts, but in character, mean more. Mr. Rosenthal passed away 10 years ago, but his family owned the building until just last year. The letter was honored until this new company acquired it. He looked at Barnes, now suddenly pale. There was no new lease. Just a notice of increase taped to my door. I didn't sign anything. I never agreed to the new terms. The judge leaned forward, studying the document. Then she turned to the clerk. I'd like a copy of this entered into the case file. She paused, eyes narrowing. Mr. Barnes, do you or your client have any documentation that supersedes this agreement? Barnes opened his mouth, then hesitated. Your Honor, this isn't a legal lease. It's a letter. It has no standing under. But it's a statement of intent. It's a historical document. And you admitted this tenant had no signed lease under your client's new ownership, which puts your claim of contractual breach into question. She glanced at Harold again. This will require further review. Barnes sat back, stunned. Harold returned to his seat, not triumphant, not even relieved, but anchored. For the first time in weeks, maybe years, he felt the weight on his shoulders shift, if only slightly. The journey wasn't over, but something had changed. He wasn't just an old man fighting eviction. He was a man who had returned with nothing but a promise and held on to it long enough for the world to remember. The court resumed after a short recess, but the air was no longer thick with casual dismissal. There was something taut beneath the surface now, a quiet tension that even the murmurs in the gallery dared not break. Barnes sat stiffer in his seat, thumbing nervously through his notes. The judge leaned slightly forward, her expression unreadable. Harold rose, once more. He held no papers this time, no exhibits, no legal citations. Just a small box, black and worn, barely the size of his palm. He walked slowly to the stand, then turned to face the court. I wasn't going to share this, he said, his voice low but steady. Not because it isn't relevant, but because some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. He opened the box. Inside lay a silver star medal. It didn't gleam under the courtroom lights. Its surface was dulled by time, the ribbon slightly frayed. Yet it caught every eye in the room. Even Barnes stopped moving. Even the judge sat still. Harold didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. This was given to me after the attack on our compound in Beirut. October 1983. We lost 241 men that day. Marines, sailors, soldiers. I made it out with one leg shattered and more shrapnel than skin. I carried 2 men out of the rubble. One died in my arms. The other still sends me Christmas cards. He closed the box slowly, reverently. This medal isn't why I stayed in that apartment for 40 years. It's not why Saul Rosenthal gave me a place to live. But it's why, when I couldn't sleep for days, when I woke up screaming, when the war followed me into every quiet moment, that apartment became the only place that still felt like shelter, like home. He looked straight at Barnes now. To you, it's a unit, a square footage, an asset. But to me, it's ground I never stopped defending. The judge didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The room had already been silenced, not by law, but by gravity. Harold walked back to his seat. No applause, no cheers, just a reverent, absolute stillness. Some truths don't need argument. Some medals speak louder than words ever could. The courtroom was no longer the same. After Harold's quiet revelation, something fundamental had shifted, not just in the proceedings, but in the people. The judge sat back slowly, her hands steepled in front of her, eyes lingering on the small, closed box on the witness stand as if it had become a relic of something sacred. Even the court clerk, who had been tapping keys without looking up, had stopped. No one moved. Barnes cleared his throat.
Once. Twice.
His mouth opened to speak, but no sound came out. For the first time in the entire hearing, the corporate attorney seemed adrift, his practiced confidence stripped bare. He looked down at his notes and saw that they meant nothing. They were words on a page. Harold had just spoken in something deeper. He straightened his tie, unnecessarily. Mr. Wallace, he finally said, voice lower now, slower, almost careful. He paused again. I'd like to retract my earlier characterization of your tenancy as problematic. Clearly, your history with the property is substantial. He did not meet Harold's eyes. But the tone said what he couldn't. Respect. In the gallery, even the opposing side, the young woman from the property management firm, had gone quiet, her eyes softening. She wasn't more than 30, likely born long after Harold had limped out of that smoking compound in Beirut. But something in his story had touched even her. You didn't have to be a soldier to understand sacrifice, or the quiet kind of courage it took to carry a memory for 40 years. The judge spoke last. Her voice was level, but it carried something new, not just authority, but deference. Mr. Wallace, thank you for your testimony. The court acknowledges your service, not just to your country, but to your community. I will be reviewing the lease documentation thoroughly, but let me be clear. This court will consider all factors, including the human cost of displacement. Harold didn't smile. He didn't need to. Something far greater than a legal victory had taken root. He had reminded them all, this wasn't just about rent or real estate. It was about the quiet lives people build on ground hard-earned. And when that ground is threatened, there are still ways, even in a courtroom, to stand and hold the line. With silence, with dignity, and with a metal that weighed more than gold. As the judge adjourned the hearing with a soft rap of her gavel, a hush lingered in the courtroom, not out of confusion, but reverence. The usual scraping of chairs and hurried conversations didn't come. Instead, people remained still, as if reluctant to break the silence Harold had created. He rose slowly, not out of frailty, but with the quiet composure of a man who had borne far heavier burdens than the weight of today. The box containing the silver star remained on the witness stand. For a moment, it seemed he might leave it there, as if it now belonged to the story more than to him. But he stepped forward, took it in hand, and held it to his chest, not proudly, but protectively, like one might hold a memory. No cameras clicked. No reporters chased him. And yet, as he turned to leave, every eye in that room followed him. Some with shame, some with awe, but all with a kind of still respect. The lawyer for the opposition stood as he passed, his posture no longer confrontational, but almost apologetic. The young woman from the management company gave a small nod, barely perceptible, but sincere. Even the bailiff, a man hardened by 1,000 procedural days, gave him a faint, wordless gesture of acknowledgement. Harold walked through the hallway alone, but his footsteps echoed like a slow drumbeat. Steady.
Certain.
Outside, the world continued. Cars rushed by. A dog barked. People passed him on the steps without a second glance. To them, he was just another old man in a faded jacket, holding a weathered box. But to those inside that courtroom, and perhaps to those who would hear of what had happened there, he would never be just a tenant again. He was the man who came with nothing but his story and left without a word of victory, because he didn't need to win loudly to be remembered. And in the silence that followed his exit, something remained. Not noise, not applause, but the undeniable weight of legacy.